access is a tremendous issue. You have to have the health systems in place to even allow patients to engage in care. And so how can you create an equitable infrastructure that allows patients to engage in care?
The technologists that are building a lot of these technologies, they kind of start with the assumption that the infrastructure is there and it's already perfect.
Running many of these clinical trials, you end up seeing patients who are flying all over the country to get on wait lists for the same trial at 7 or 8 places.
Well, how do you think we fix that, Dr. Parikh? Like, do you think that is like a government mandate? Is that we need to lift some of the regulatory hurdles? On this podcast, we talk a lot about the workflow gaps that exist in oncology. But there's a larger gap at play. What if the patient never makes it to the oncologist in the first place? That's part of my conversation with Dr. Aparna Parikh. She's a practicing colorectal oncologist, the medical director of GI oncology at Mass General Brigham, and associate professor at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Parikh spends a lot of time thinking about the patients that need the most help from technology. The ones that live hours away from a screening, or don't know how to log into a portal, or live in rural areas without access to basic pathology. Today, in part 1 of our conversation, we discuss what can get in the way between patients and care, and where technology can and can't help. Then we get into the world of clinical trials. Dr. Parikh tells us how the current system favors the most resourced patients. And we discuss how more structured data can help drive a better, more equitable model. Finally, Dr. Parikh shares what she'd want as a clinician trying to match a patient to a trial in real time. And it's not what most technologists would think of building first. If you care about what AI and who AI is really serving in oncology, this one will challenge some really interesting assumptions. Let's get into it. Hi, Dr. Parikh. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
The first place that I really wanted to start was with access. I know you've spent a lot of time kind of thinking about cancer care in places that don't have the resources of like a Mass General. I wanted to kind of start by getting your take on, what impact do you think AI can have in closing that gap?
Access is a tremendous issue. I think, as you alluded to, I think we're talking both about global access, but also I think there are several, very much underserved areas within the United States. I think certain demographics that have truly less access to care, as well as certain populations that have less access to care, particularly the tertiary and quaternary level care that is sometimes required for patients living with a cancer diagnosis. One of the challenges I have with addressing this question is I think part of it is you have to have the health systems in place to even allow patients to engage in care. And so how can you create an equitable infrastructure that allows patients, wherever they may be, to engage in care? And part of that is knowledge and knowledge perpetuation and ensuring that there is as much information dissemination to underrepresented communities, both nationally and internationally. But knowledge dissemination is only one part of it. And I think AI can be really helpful with that knowledge and dissemination. But if you don't have a infrastructure to help care for patients, and navigate them through the complexities of the healthcare system, I think there's a little bit of a hesitation with the use of the words navigators, but you really do need people to be able to access the healthcare system in an efficient way. It takes a tremendous amount of resources as well as knowledge and education to even navigate the complexities of the medical system within oncology. And so can AI lower those barriers to really help people not only engage in care, but then stay in care?
Do you think the gap is more around kind of access to the information, or is it just about like matching the information to the patient to the right moment in time and having it kind of served in context workflow? If you had to kind of design that infrastructure, what do you think are the biggest gaps, and how do you think that it would be best kind of applied in the workflow?
Yeah, there's probably 2 areas of gaps. I think one or a couple areas of gaps. I think information is only one piece of it. And, I think taking an example like colon cancer, incredibly common cancer, leading cause of cancer mortality now in patients under 50 for both men and women. Yet there's still tremendous lack of information in terms of how much of a problem it is. I think people don't understand necessarily risk factors. They don't necessarily know what the screening age is. They don't necessarily understand who should get screened. But again, empowerment with knowledge is critical. But if a patient, is 3 or 4 hours away from a center that can do an endoscopy, they have to take a whole day off of work to do a colorectal cancer screening, or they have a FIT test and they do a stool-based test that's positive. If there's no one to ensure that that positive result gets acted on, then what happens to that patient? And I find that even in my own just general primary care, appointments pop up into the gateway, and it's great that I can see it and manage the appointments. But I think there's still a lot of lack of really good literacy with engaging with even the health systems that think that they're actually helping patients by having these tools online. Um, we do virtual care still, right? Many of my even older patients still can't figure out how to log on well to Zoom. Some still don't have access to computing technology. And so I think there's tremendous opportunity, but I think just jumping right ahead to like how AI can solve all of these things is missing a little bit of the kind of fundamental barriers that some patients have limitations to. And this is just, I'm really focusing on the United States. You start thinking about low and middle income countries. I think the challenges are even more profound in terms of just health systems strengthening. And, if you get diagnosed with a cancer, then do you actually have resources to access the care you need? Do you have resources to the pathology? Do you have resources to the surgery skills that are needed? Do you have access to radiotherapy, chemotherapy? Certainly immunotherapies, certainly are not available in low and middle income context. I think there's a couple of tools that I think we're seeing be deployed that AI may be able to help with a little bit. From the pathology side, there's a lot of work thinking about how digital pathology may be able to enable more access to deep and basic pathology services, not relying on necessarily people power to do that alone. I think you still will need the pathologist. Similarly, I think radiologist, you'll still need the radiologist to really understand the clinical context as you're looking at scans. But I think we're seeing now opportunities for more kind of efficiency and then augmenting the skills of the radiologist. And could that be, if you had the access to radiology equipment in terms of reading scans, could that be enhanced by technology? I think the answer is yes, but you have to have all of those kind of systems in place.
I think that's a really interesting take. I mean, I think, a lot of the conversations that we have on the podcast, really talk about how AI can kind of help match patients to the right clinical context, help the physicians in their workflow make the right clinical decisions. But I think what you're really getting at is, you can have all of that, but it's missing an entire part of the story about how can you actually get patients on those right therapies? How can you get patients, access to a lot of these things that they're more structural barriers than they are just pure information barriers. And
Exactly.
I think that's a neat topic that I don't think we've, spent a lot of time kind of discussing.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's the decision support and there's the remote diagnostics and tele-oncology things. But, I think you really have to think about the basic resources that are there to take care of an oncology patient. Because it's complex. Some work I've done in India with a group, they've done a tremendous job where they are kind of going into rural villages, screening patients at risk for cancer. So one example is in India, head and neck cancer is really prevalent from a lot of chewing tobacco use. And So they go to these farming communities where chewing tobacco use is incredibly high. And they start to do like oral cancer screenings, just training community health workers to take a look in the mouth, identifying potential lesions. And then, with a, pretty sophisticated technology system, really getting those patients who otherwise may not be engaged in the healthcare system with both kind of digital, but also, language concordant people support tracking to ensure that none of those patients that have a suspicious lesion get missed. And if they get diagnosed, then really mapping out, if they can get some of their care, within an hour, some of their care is necessarily needed to be done 3 hours away, but not everything necessarily needs to be done 3 hours away. How do we kind of map the patient's journey of their care in a way that is the least prohibitive from a financial perspective for a patient, that's most feasible, rather than saying, okay, you need to go to the major tertiary care center for everything, but what can we do? What can we do more locally? What can we do more regionally? What needs to be kind of spread out, and helping the patient navigate that? And I think that's something that I think we could probably do a better job of, within our rural populations here. I think another good example of that in the United States is, Indian Health Services has done a tremendous job with, more Native communities too, who have high risk for certain cancers and particularly, but again, don't have access to care. So can we use technology to help patients get the care they need beyond just providing them information? Because if you provide and you don't get them to the care and help them navigate the complex systems, they will be lost.
It's really interesting because I feel like, my circles in San Francisco, the technologists that are building a lot of these technologies, they kind of start with the assumption that the infrastructure is there and it's already perfect. They're like, okay, the patient's already at the hospital. How do we actually help the doctors make the right decisions? But I think the perspective that you have is, and I think this is a real opportunity, is like, we can't just stop there, right? Like, how do we think about each of these populations as kind of like their own unique problems, and figure out how do we actually get in front of these patients in a way that would actually fit into their lifestyle, into their life context. And I feel like, widening the aperture on how you think about innovation is such a
100%. And I'm for you mentioning that, because it's one of the things that drives me a little bit nuts with these conversations is that, like, if you don't even have the basic infrastructure to like care for these patients, like, or they can't afford like a day off to do this, like, none of the tools that you're going to build are actually going to move the needle. So,
Yeah. And you said something really interesting because you're like, yeah, like some people, we talk about clinical decision support and AI, and like some people are still having difficulty like logging into a Zoom call, right? And just like the basic technology literacy
technology,
is
yeah, like basic technology literacy, even here is, many of my patients who prefer telemedicine models, who are, especially the older or certain populations, like they're just like, just call me, right? Like I can't figure out how to log on, and you send them information on their gateway. Like you send them pings that you're due for, you're due for colon cancer screening, or you're due for this, or you're overdue for this. They're not logging in, right?
you're like, we send them the message. We're like, what good is the message if they can't see it,
Yeah,
right?
so I actually worry a little bit that if without a lot of consideration, that you're at risk for even widening of disparities, and like the educated, savvy or patients are going to be the ones who are going to be able to take avail of these tools. I see this even with the access to knowledge for clinical trials, even within oncology. The ability for the well educated, well networked, well resourced patient to access knowledge to clinical trials, for example, is on a different level than the average patient walking in the door. And
Yep.
you're kind of presenting information that even for that well-educated patient can be really hard to discern and understand the differences and nuances and why a particular trial may be better versus others. And it's hard even for a well-educated patient. And then take a patient that is not even really, I think, has still a taboo of what research is, doesn't really understand what a clinical trial is. And then you're trying to give them the tools to like navigate, the landscape of clinical trials. And I think there's some just basic pieces there that could really get lost because of how complex even the trial information can be. And so if you say, okay, like we have to figure out how to help those patients, we still have to figure out how to make it more tenable, even for the well-informed patient, because I think that information deluge is incredibly onerous and incredibly hard to dissect. But I think we have to, again, so similar to the conversation we were just having, is like we have to make it easier for all patients. I think there's tremendous room for opportunity for informed patients, but it's even more important to figure out how to help patients that have no knowledge of clinical trials or what they actually mean to be able to access this information. And I think that's why, I think when we look at in the United States, like I think our clinical trial enrollment is pretty dismal in terms of how many patients are actually enrolling. And I think, again, knowledge is only a part of it. But there's a lot of other barriers that limit that ability for people to get on trials.
Yeah. I mean, but I think even with that, right? Like, I think I'm incredibly optimistic just because, like, being in working in technology for such a long time, it really feels like we're at this tipping point where, before technology kind of required people to, work it into their own workflow, right? And there's almost kind of like you have to kind of push technology in. A basic example is like, a lot of these systems that were previously designed were kind of like input output based, right? Like you needed somebody that was educated enough to give a system the right inputs so that it could tell you the right output. And that led to just a lot of complexity. And I think it would, it kind of accelerates that disparity of like, who are the people that are capable of, putting the right inputs or have the time to put the right inputs in. But now I think, with AI and some of the advancements that we're seeing in technology, is like there's this tipping point where it's able to kind of just pull a lot of these inputs in automatically and help patients kind of get the right output faster, or even in the right context, right? Like one of the things that we're able to do is figure out what reading level we should be telling these patients their care should be at, right? Like some of the basic things of I remember when my mom was going through breast cancer, we would be reading these notes and we'd be scratching our heads, like asking ours, like, what are all these like, medicalese or, like legalese that we're reading. But, finally, I think we're at a point where the technology can actually translate a lot of this information in a way that is more digestible for somebody.
One example, though, of just, again, the resource piece. So let's talk about the KRAS revolution and pancreatic cancer or GI cancer. So KRAS is one of the most commonly mutated oncogenes, and for years has been really hard to drug. And we started to make inroads with a couple of KRAS inhibitors in lung cancer and colon cancer. And over the last couple of years, we've seen tremendous data for pancreatic cancer and having a KRAS inhibitor, which is 90+% of pancreatic cancer patients have a KRAS mutation. So running many of these clinical trials, right? And you end up seeing patients who are flying all over the country to get on wait list for the same trial at 7 or 8 places, right? Because the slots are hard to get. There's no real-time awareness of slots, eligibility. Okay, fine. Let's say you are an eligible patient. We can come back to eligibility in a minute, but say you're eligible. The well-resourced patient, because there's no central management of this, will potentially go to 6 or 7 different places to get on 6 or 7 different wait lists. And then as soon as they get a slot, and this happened with one of my patients who got a slot at a Midwestern site for a particular trial. We did not have a slot for this particular patient. And that particular patient who lives in the Northeast, who should have been on the trial in the Northeast, because they got a slot in the Midwest, ended up starting on the trial in the Midwest. And that is just silly, right? It is silly, and it is also just not fair. Like, I'm happy that that particular patient was able to access that trial when they needed it, not where they needed it. But like, what about all my patients who can't get on wait list at 6 or 7 different places? So there's like this gaming of the system that I truly feel that, like, beyond just clinicaltrials.gov. And then I've lived through and seen so many of these trial matching companies that kind of come and go, and then they charge the patients, for these navigators and then the navigators are emailing the investigators or the research team on behalf of the patients. Again, there are so many opportunities for promoting efficiency there, but also equity there as well.
Yeah. Well, how do you think we fix that, Dr. Parikh? Like, do you think that is like a government mandate? Is that kind of like we need to like lift some of the regulatory hurdles in kind of the trials? Do we need to figure out better ways to, incentivize trial accruals at the system level? Like, what do you think is kind of the best solution for
I
that?
think it's probably some interplay of like private public partnership, with biopharma, biotech, the public sector, government, to really try to figure out how trials are set up and run and distributed. It's also, I think, a little bit of the onus is on biopharma to also just think about their ways of managing even slots and eligibility. Um, and then making some of the, visits required. I understand that for phase 1 trials, there has to be incredible vigilance in terms of safety of the patients.
Mhm.
But, are there ways to kind of monitor patients where they are, for example, rather than having them need to come into the academic medical center for kind of every visit? Is it home monitoring? Is it home nurses? Is it home blood draws? Is it, again, I just talked about the technology limitations that some people's face, but in this setting, if you could train people or give them an iPad or give them something at home to do their reporting at home, kind of use mobile phlebotomy to kind of allow them to not uproot their lives as much as they, wouldn't necessarily be required to travel to an AMC for these visits. I think there's ways to do that, but I think, currently the system is, you go to the major academic places that run trials well, and those are the patients that have access to those AMCs are going to be the ones who are
Yeah.
aware, and that's why we do a terrible job of enrollment. I think there's really good data, that Black and Hispanic patients enroll at far lower rates than expected, just based on their share of the cancer population. I saw some number at one point that, like, for one particular trial, for example, kind of Black patients, had enrolled at about like 20% at like of the level of their expected representation for a particular cancer. If you then think about the Native population again, I think another group that is incredibly underrepresented. So I think there's not only the representation piece, but then trying to make it easier to conduct the actual trial. And I think the conduct of the trial ease with AI is a tremendous opportunity. The other thing that even comes up at our own institution within our network sites is there are patients that might have an alteration that is eligible for a trial, and it just might get missed, right? So why aren't we doing a better job with our EMRs of kind of flagging there's no reason that in 2026 that any potential alteration or a particular profile of a patient could not be screened by some AI tool and kind of basic lab values and basic eligibility. You might ultimately need a human check on that. But for baseline screening, I think I can't see why AI can't necessarily take that out of the human role and take that into the computing world and really lower the barrier, even just for the people power needed to find patients. I think you hear providers say a lot how challenging it is to the time commitment to put people on trials. So even when trials aren't
Exactly.
available, the clinicians are finding it really onerous to do it because they have to do all this stuff. And a lot of this extra stuff, I think, from screening to identifying a patient and then reporting once you're on a trial, I think could really be helped by technology.
Yeah. I think to me, I think that's the lowest hanging fruit, right? I think, you know, there's a lot of, I think, bottlenecks in kind of the patient side and, you know, the access side that we kind of spent a lot of time talking about. But really, I think, you know, the the best resource for that patient to understand what they need to do is their own oncologist. And I feel like, you know, today the workload and what is expected out of oncologists, the complexity is actually making that job harder and harder. And then, you know, finally you throw on a trial and the workflow that they have with patients that aren't on a trial, and patients that are on a trial are completely different. And it just becomes harder and harder for their oncologist to have the time to be able to invest and really, you know, think about what they need to do. And so, like, you know, I think the opportunity for AI, or at least the lowest hanging fruit, is how can we free up the oncologist's time to have them spend time on these harder problems and let AI, you know, do a lot of these kind of these, you know, screening work, the documentation, some of the things that, you know, I think what AI is actually good for, so that we can free up the doctor's time to do some of the highly complex tasks that might be more difficult for the AI to do today.
Yeah, and but I think like taking one step back is even within a big healthcare system, like I can't even keep track of every trial that is open within and like MGB, right? So we have, you know, tremendous like hundreds of clinical trials open and let alone navigating nationally. I think it's hard for me to even keep track of what's open internally and what's enrolling internally, let alone navigating the complexity of kind of national availability. I think the other area where I think AI could help, especially the community based oncologists or the non disease centric experts, is, you know, I have a very good pulse on most, not all, clinical trials happening in the colorectal cancer space because I am attuned to everything colorectal cancer. But for other colleagues, even you know, academic medical center colleagues that might be seeing everything in GI rather than just colon cancer, like I see, um, it is a lot to keep track of.
Yeah.
Let alone a community oncologist who has to see breast cancer and prostate cancer and colon cancer and you know every cancer.
Yep.
And so even if you make their task easier once they are potentially thinking about a trial, we have to figure out a better way to really get the trial information in a cohesive way and an efficient way to the providers. I think we saw the testing companies do that for a while, and I think we see improvements with the testing companies who, you know, do create a report of potential availabilities of trials based on actionable alterations. But that's just a list. And then what do you do with that list as community doc?
I'd be interested to get your answer to that, right? Because I think what we're seeing on our side, like, cancer treatment has gotten incredibly complex, right? Like all the different molecular subtypes, the biomarkers, the new targets. You know, I think there's a huge opportunity to leverage AI to kind of reduce that complexity. But I think if you were to think about your own workflow, what would you think would be the most useful, right? Like, I think technologists would come up with the idea of like, hey, like let's just put these options in a test and then give it to Dr. Parikh and she'll be super happy. But I think,
I would love if I got that information back of eligible, like a potential trials that are out there. I would love like a single touch point of where I could click into that trial, briefly put in like a brief demographic, like basic information about the patient.
Mhm,
And then, no, not only are there any immediate red flags for eligibility,
mhm,
but if that patient is eligible, I don't want a link just to clinicaltrials.gov that tells me the 20 places that the trial is opening for or opening at. I want to know if that patient were to make a visit at any of those places next week, or which is the closest place they can make a visit that they're actually going to get a slot in real time. And that is hard because slots change on a day-to-day basis and availability. So I'm talking about more early phase trials. So this could apply. Slot availability applies a little bit less to later phase trials, but the eligibility and availability principles still apply. But for early phase trials, it's incredibly iterative on a day to day, even morning to evening basis around slot availability. So I would love to know, like, if patient is eligible, where can they? There's a slot available, and if that slot is not available near the patient's home, then this is the next patient in line to be able to get that next slot in an area that's convenient for them and not having to schlep across the country for that slot. I would love that, but I think we haven't seen that yet happen.
yeah, I mean, it's crazy that to hear you say that because I think that's where kind of that private partnership would need to exist. I think the technology exists to be able to create a system like that. I think the difficulty is like what you said is getting the information about the slot availability, and that's really something that's kind of like a interoperability problem. And like, how do you actually get the data from all these different systems in real time in a latency that would actually have the system perform well? Because I think it's very difficult for like a company or like a technology company to get enough of the systems together to say, hey, we want to create this, give us your data, let's build the data pipelines to be able to power this product. But yeah, I think to your point, like that's probably where kind of like a more public private partnership where it would need to exist for it to work.